Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 418A, December the 7th, 1979, side one of the tape. The Iranian crisis is now starting its second month, and we'll have to get used to that in the news. I'm going to run through some of that very quickly and hopefully get to some of the recent murders or deaths that are terribly important that are piling up that I'm not able to cover each week. There were two articles this past week in the newspaper that I think were of primary importance. I have about 60 very important articles on Iran in front of me, but the two that epitomize what are going on are from the New York Times. One is a James Reston report that was in last Sunday's paper. He went to the Soviet Union to sound out the Soviet Union on how they felt. I'm sure that Reston was sent there to see if the Soviets would hint at whether or not they would enter into a war if the United States began to bomb Iran, if the trials started there and we attacked them. Would the Soviets enter into the war, or would they stay out of it like they did when we were in Southeast Asia? So James Reston from the New York Times went over the Soviet Union to see officials to sound them out, and the officials that he quoted in the article made several important statements that really set the stage for what is going on. And I want to quote those, some of them directly and some to paraphrase. What these people in the Soviet Union told him was that Mr. Brzezinski is their favorite villain, that they think that he's the most detrimental person to world peace, and I believe that's true also. I think Mr. Brzezinski wants a war, that 1985 war against the Soviet Union, and they realized that they almost had a meeting place or a détente, a period up till 1974, when matters really took a turn from the worst. In this article, I'll quote directly, they stated in Moscow, rather sadly, even with kind of injured self-pity, that the United States has always regarded the emergence of the Soviet Union in 1917 as an illegitimate child of history and has never fully adjusted to the new facts of a modern world. The core of the problem, officials insist, is that the United States seems unable to realize it can no longer have its own way in the world, as it did in the first years after World War II, but is now vulnerable, like other nations, and compelled to come to terms with conflicting political, economic, and military forces. The Soviet officials said that America's problem is not the Soviet Union, but with itself. It has not redefined its position in a world of different centers of power, no longer subject to U.S. domination, and must sort out those facts of the 1980s and make the psychological adjustment necessary to meet them. What James Reston is saying, quoting the Soviet officials, is that the United States never accepted the Russian Revolution, that the Tsar and his wife could be kicked out, that the people could organize against the monarchy. We thought of them as an illegitimate child that during World War II we could overrule and try to take. When we didn't win that war, we armed for World War III, and that we cannot face the facts of modern life, that people can figure things out for themselves and rise up and have a revolution and take care of governments themselves without the United States or Great Britain or Germany interfering. This article says that the latest impediment to détente and peace are the U.S. policies towards Europe and China, the proposed deployment of 600 new U.S. missiles in forward positions in Europe, capable of hitting anything up to the Urals, and they said this was an obvious threat to the security of the USSR, and the basis of which they wanted to control his strategic weapons. And they went on to say that we're playing the China card, making alliances with China, which would be intolerable and a threat to the Soviet Union. The decline of the relations in the United States since 1974, the regular trade relations began in 1974, that Mr. Brzezinski wants war, we're aiming towards a war and deteriorating, and that the United States cannot adjust to the new facts of the modern world. I received a letter from one of my favorite listeners and subscribers who made some suggestions or criticisms about my viewpoint of the political scene, and one of the questions or statements he made was, in quotes, "I wish you would tone down hammering the people and the capitalistic system and war won't come from threatening Jimmy Carter's administration. I mentioned last week that Jimmy Carter was looking weak and that by having a wartime power, Mr. Brzezinski and Mr. Kissinger and Chase Manhattan would hold on to their world power and grab, and that if the chips came down that there was a legitimate revolution against the United States and Iran, similar to the one that happened in 1917 in Russia against the Tsar, that we would go to war, that we're not going to adjust to the fact that people can rule by themselves without the United States or Germany or Great Britain interfering. I can't tone down my feelings about the capitalist system because I don't think it can survive. I believe that capitalism keeps stretching to the point known as fascism, and when you have to have secret police and terror and torture camps and arm the world and ignore your health of your citizens, the health of people abroad that you have wiped out or drugged or done mental experiments on, when you have to have police that you mistrust trained by the Gestapo and the Nazi agents and kill presidents, civil rights leaders, and continuous political assassinations all over the world. If that's what it takes to keep capitalism going, capitalism is just that fine line to fascism, and that's what we have. I'm not knocking capitalism, I'm knocking fascism, and I believe that this government will not stop until the whole world is fascist, because this is the continuation of World War III or the 1,000-Year Reich. If we had a choice, I would take a capitalism similar to, say, Sweden or Canada. Many people would say that's socialist. But I certainly don't like what the United States is doing, and I don't call it capitalism. I very clearly call it fascism. The answer to the Soviet Union and to James Reston that was published in last week's papers this weekend, Sunday, came in the New York Times by Henrik Smith on Wednesday of this week. And I think this article is the most clear, that spells out the position of Congress and the Pentagon at this time and their intentions. And again, I call this fascism. It's an article called Turning Point for U.S. Policy, and what it's really saying is no more nice guys. We're going to send the troops in wherever we want. And I'm going to read a few direct quotations from that article in case you don't take the New York Times. The article said the Iranian crisis has brought an important shift of attitudes in Washington. The United States will project its power to the third world. It will develop greater military capability for protecting its interests. Now, what it's saying there is that the interest of the multinational is what comes first. They're not going to pay any attention to the slaves anymore, and no more nice guy. The corporations have taken the weapons and the spy systems, and the masses are not about to destroy them. The article says, in quotes, the liberals and conservatives alike are speaking of their political and psychological watershed being more important than the 50 hostages. The men that are hostages in Iran are not as important as what is going on and the view that we're giving the world. In quotes, this is the end of the Vietnam syndrome, according to George Ball, who's a policymaker with the Trilateralists and the Bilderbergers. No more sob sisters or defeat. He said, in quotes, we have a sense of guilt complex over Vietnam. We must move away from the post-Vietnam reticence. Now, just getting off from that direct quote, we left the country in shambles, totally bankrupt, chemicals in the water, people diseased, families broken up, so many deaths over there. We walk away, and George Ball says we have to walk away from Vietnam and not have a guilt complex. Then the article quotes Gary Hart of Colorado. They go on to say that these are the liberals in Congress that they're quoting, Senator Church and Gary Hart and so forth. Hart said, it's not just Iran. We've been through a period of shocks over the past 5 years because of the fall of Saigon and the formation of OPEC and the oil embargo. Our military supremacy seems to have ended, and there's increased nationalism abroad and less fear of the United States because others are more potent than us. He goes on and illustrates that we are not supreme all over the world anymore. Since Vietnam, the article says the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction of national self-doubt and total non-intervention in the third world. I don't know what they mean. I think the only country we lost was Nicaragua. The rest of all of South America is fascist. But the article says the Iranian crisis forged a consensus that we have to redress that balance. the visual image, and this is what really hurts them, the visual image of American humiliation in Iran is important. They have stirred a public reaction and an acute sense of long-term American vulnerability. That community must now expand its military capabilities and treat the Middle East as a sphere of influence where Washington must be prepared to use its power. It is our flag that is being desecrated. It's our people who are blindfolded. The apologies are now over. The trend toward increased defense spending was starting, this article says, before the Iranian crisis, but then Senator Sam Nunn from Georgia said we're going to fight for more weapons. I read just last Sunday's paper that if Ted Kennedy gets the nomination, he's considering Mr. Nunn as a vice president, and this is a man that's been pushing for more and more weapons continuously in Congress. The article says before the Iranian crisis, they argued to increase defense spending based on Soviet competition, but now the defense spending is to protect the oil supplies for the United States of America. The Carter administration wants a long-range program to develop rapid deployment forces to respond to upheavals in the Third World, particularly the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Of course, that would start with Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Ethiopia. The White House earmarked $300 million for long-range cargo planes, ships for deployment, and billions of dollars will be needed in the next decade. And Frank Church said we are prepared in principle to endorse military intervention even in friendly countries if Western oil interests are threatened. Senator Church said the highly volatile and unpredictable politics of the Middle East, the wave of hysteria in the Islamic world, the explosive possibilities of countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq tell us we have to be prepared to take action to protect our vital interests. The vital interests of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, those are the trilateral areas, and must take care of the Saudi Arabian oil fields. This was in the New York Times, as if Saudi Arabia is a third world country. They're asking Japan to take care of, with us, with the Saudi Arabian oil fields. It would necessitate military action if our interests were threatened. If that required the organization of strike forces, there would be strong support on Capitol Hill. The liberal Democrats, it goes on, are advocating Navy buildup, permanent aircraft carriers close to the Indian Ocean, and they're prodding Japan, that was formerly an Axis country fighting us during World War II, to take a more active role in the Pacific to protect sea lanes. Senator Charles Mathias of Maryland urged the rebuilding of the intelligence capabilities as the CIA and the DIA, national security agencies, of course. And then the article closes by saying it is important to shed any qualms about American power. No longer are the public and Congress going to be saying that a military role for the United States outside of Europe is wrong, and we're going to head and use our military if we want. Now, when Saudi Arabia reads that, and New York Times article, and doesn't respond to that, I'll be very surprised. But the implications here are that we will ask Germany and Japan, Europe and Japan, to help us keep a permanent fleet there, and any time we want to take that oil, we will. Now, I said a long time ago that this story about the Saudi Arabians pulling money out of the American banks and bankrupting, and such as described in that book, The Crash of 79, wouldn't happen because we confiscate their money and just go in and take their oil. And this is actually, I'm very surprised, almost a declaration of war to Saudi Arabia, that if we want the oil, we're going to take it. No more nice guys. We need oil. We've moved from Asia. Forget the Asian conflict. Forget all the sob sisters talk of napalm or Agent Orange or war or the anti-war protests. I'm sure. Don't listen to these people, the Jane Fondas and the sob sisters. We're going in where we need it and take what we need. And this is the conflict of the policy written down in the New York Times of the American Congress and their attitude and the War Department's attitude as compared to what the Soviet Union says, that the United States simply cannot grow up and be mature enough to accept the fact that people do have revolutions, that they do change, and that there's changes all over the world, that we have to be sob sisters, we want to control things, and we don't have it our way, we rush in. The Soviet Union is saying, that's our problem, the way we run in. And then 3 days later comes an article that says we intend to send the fleet, to send the money, so that our whole economy in this country is going to be geared towards making war in the Middle East on the excuse that we'll need to protect the oil. It's ours if we want it. And we'll extend our fleet, our arms, everything. If it's there and we want it and the multinationals want it, we'll take it. The empires of Great Britain were temporarily broken up during World War II. The United States stepped in along with British intelligence and the French and Germans. They've earmarked the globe, they've marked it off, and they're going to take it no matter the price. Before I get to other matters, I do want to summarize once more my analysis of the Iranian problem so far, and I have discussed it on page 415 and 417. If you don't have those, you can get the earlier ones as the situation is building up. First of all, I don't agree with the newscasters, the people that are writing to me that Khomeini is crazy. I don't believe he's crazy. I believe that he was put into power as a ploy to get our troops over in the Middle East, to get a foothold against the Soviet Union, to be assured that if we make a war in 1985 that we have all the oil we need by having our troops very well stationed through the whole Middle East, that it would supply us with that oil we would need to make war against the Soviet Union. I think that Khomeini got into power, and he has pushed out certain people that helped put him into power, and he's a genius. I don't think people get to where they are just being silly or crazy. Khomeini's dealing with a generation that is 26 years old now since the Shah was put into power. His father was kicked out of there. He was playing around with the Nazis. The Shah came into power through the Central Intelligence Agency. And there are enough people in Iran that are illiterate, that don't have hot and cold water, that don't like the secret police, that don't like to be shot down in the streets, that see industrialization and want a part of it. I don't think it's so much that they're turning their back entirely on modernization or industrialization, but if it means that it's only the advantage of the very wealthy and the rest remain slaves, then they'd rather not have any of it. This is what we're seeing in other countries where we have progress and industrialization, such as in Korea and the Philippines, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and so forth, down in Brazil or Argentina. Progress, social progress, and jet-set life is very fine for a handful, but as long as the others live in the Stone Age and have no benefits of it, then they rather just have everyone stay where they are or work themselves up equally. So that what we're seeing here is a group of people who are being taken through the Shah's palace. They're being shown his gold toilets and gold fixtures and the jewels and the silver, and they realize what their homes are like, and Khomeini has fired their imagination. He is the first person that I know of to speak up to the United States and the CIA, and he's a symbol. It's a symbolism that the people in Washington are going crazy about. They don't want a trial. They don't want any information out, and he threatened a large institution like the Chase Manhattan Bank by wanting the money of the Shah taken back to his country. I don't know anybody who's challenged David Rockefeller and the New York bankers and claimed that a head of state who left stole the money away from them. I also think the Mideast crisis is manipulated in a very complex way with a cast of characters that are fantastic, their background and their training, and maybe we'll go into those another time. But the United States is sabotaged from the inside. I think that there are forces disrupting and disuniting us. There are people turning us against each other and the various candidates. I feel that we're being isolated from the real world the way it should be, and that we're inadequately prepared for any kind of confrontation. The next one we get into, we'll lose, and that our advisors are not really helping us to be strong. Kissinger and Brzezinski are the ringleaders in breaking this country's back and putting us back in the Stone Age. And Khomeini is aware of the people in Washington and of the forces, and after they put him in, he fired the imagination of the people in Iran in a way that the puppet masters didn't expect him to do. And, of course, the question that follows is what happens next? If the Chase Manhattan is threatened with money being withdrawn, if Kissinger or Brzezinski may be out of power, if Jimmy Carter lost the elections, would we go to war? I brought that up before, and I believe that it's an excuse, the trial that will take place will be the excuse for us to bomb, and even if the hostages are all killed and a few others are killed, it will not matter to Jimmy Carter and the others. It will be a time where Carter will come out strong, looking like a leader, and these people that die will be martyred, and there'll just be 50 other people that died. In the course of time, they won't be remembered so much as the fact that the threat was over and the talk of the blackmail, the talk of the trial. I don't think the people in power really give a damn about the hostages. I don't think they want to do anything but save their own banks and save their own face. And as I said before last week, Jimmy Carter was put in by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski. So I don't think he's going to back down, and I don't think he's going to let them be exposed or let them have the chance of a few ballot, putting them out, a few votes. I think that he's going to go on in there as the admiral and handle this crisis by moving into the Middle East. That doesn't mean we'll win. It doesn't mean it's smart. But I don't think the people running this country are smart, and I think they're always the last people to catch on to what's happening anyway. I have a pile of articles on Iran here that are interesting, and I'm sure all of you are following this pretty closely. The U.S. embassies were stormed in Manila, Bangkok, and Kuwait this week. Anwar Sadat invited the Shah to Egypt. Don't you think it's strange that there isn't any country that really wants him now? He may be at Paraguay with Somoza and Mengele down there. It's really weird that there isn't a country in the world that wants this person. There's a good article in the L.A. Times last week, Shah's Path to Power Retraced, and it goes into the background after World War II and his links with the CIA and their torture and murder and the cultural conflicts and so forth, the gunning down of people, how many of them and how much money was taken. Another article, The Insecurity of Saudi Arabia, the oil supply hinges on our reaction to the Iranian crisis. And this goes into Saudi Arabia is insecure about dealing with us. Another article, the United States reassures Saudis on their bank assets. They're afraid that the money may be taken from them if they deposit in this country. The charges that the men in the embassy are CIA. I'm sure you all know about those charges. Another NBC News last week, December the 3rd, they were saying on television when he went to Texas, the Shah has fewer options than most people realize. Then, of course, Jimmy Carter's mother suggested that they buy a hitman for $1 million to kill Khomeini. I think that's disgusting. And another article, how the Middle East crisis boosts Carter's campaign for president. Evans and Novak, the man who toppled the Shah. And this is about Robert Huser, Haig's deputy, and how the Shah was slipped out of office and the conflict in the Pentagon. Another article, The Bitter Shah by Jack Anderson, on the way Jimmy Carter's team had the Shah eased out and didn't supply the troops to back him up. UPI story, the Soviets see U.S. military buildup. The crisis is a pretext. And this goes on to say that we wanted our military in the Indian Ocean, so we created this crisis to impose on other people in the Middle East our troops, and our goal was to get armed interference and hold on to the oil in the Middle East. The Shah moved out to Texas, and the first person to see him from Texas was Henry Gonzalez. He's the member from the House of Representatives that received the clothing of John Connally after Kennedy's assassination and took it to his apartment and then sent it out to be dry cleaned so that the FBI was called to testify on whether they were entry or exit bullets in John Connally, which would make a difference on where the assassin was located. And they had testified, the FBI, that they had been dry cleaned, so they no longer could be used as exhibits for a homicide for the President of the United States. The man who took them in a paper bag from Texas to Washington, D.C. and had them sent to the dry cleaner was Henry Gonzalez. So it's perfectly reasonable that that same kind of a CIA mentality would be the first Texan to interview the Shah when he was taken to his state. There also was an article in the paper about mind control and brainwashing of the hostages, and it quotes Dr. Jolly West, the CIA military psychiatrist who gave an opinion on the mental state of the hostages, Jolly West was, of course, the psychiatrist, one of them that saw Jack Ruby, and they tried to pass Ruby's case off when he killed Lee Harvey Oswald as not being a conspiracy to silence Lee Harvey Oswald, but Ruby had a 1-minute epilepsy. Then Jolly West came to California to work with Ronald Reagan and UCLA and the CIA to do experimentations on Indians and blacks and minority and third world people and their brains, using UCLA as a base for their experimentation. They come out now and say he's a military man and a CIA man. He always was, when he sometimes saw Jack Ruby or Patty Hearst or talks about hostages. It's interesting how when you study the political assassinations and then other events come out, you have the same cast of characters always running through them. Another article this week, the U.S. accused of colonialism. This was in Mexico City, 1,000 nationals meeting representing 100 nations, and they accused the United States of being involved in colonialism. An article, the limitation on oil, Iran asks OPEC to stop, hold up the oil of these major countries from the United States. They appealed to Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Ecuador, Gabon, Indonesia, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. Israel came through with flying colors, just like I always said they would. I have said many times personally and on tapes or with people, radio programs, that the whole purpose of allowing Israel to exist as a country was to use it as a military base when the United States wanted to secure its oil in the Middle East. Sure enough, this week, Israel speaks up and said, if you want to use Israel as a launching pad for fighting Iran, you can. You can use us in quotes for bases. Former Israeli Defense Minister Shimon Peres. I've never supported the Israeli movement or the Zionist cause because I knew it would be a launching pad in World War III, and then in return the Arabs would retaliate by bombing Israel off the map. And by the time they said, well, we'll have peace in the Middle East and we'll go back to producing oil, there will be no more Israel. This week they had to open their mouth and offer that country as a launching pad for a war against Iran. There's another article, an alleged interview with the Shah that he's denying is in a German newspaper. This article gets in a few digs against John Kennedy and says the world is heading for an inevitable downfall. I thought that was interesting. He praised Stalin, de Gaulle, and Roosevelt and said that they'd turn over in their graves if they saw what came after them. But he didn't mention Eisenhower and Truman and John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles and Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, the people that were giving him accolades while he was in power. Another article, the United Nations wants to prove the Shah's money. They're willing to go into the finances of the Shah. I don't think that the Rockefeller-Kissinger Chase Manhattan would allow that. That's why I think that they're on the brink of a war, and I don't think they're going to even consider his money, because the money is linked to organized crime and dope, narcotics, and secret bank accounts all over the world, and they're certainly not going to get into that. Another article, Libya gets into the act. The U.S. Embassy in Libya is sacked. The United States wouldn't accept their apologies, and they want to break off with Libya. 2 men from the service were killed in Pakistan, and the United States isn't severing relationships with Pakistan. But Libya, as I said before, is one of the countries they want to attack, and so they're not accepting those apologies as an excuse to stay angry. I think on the other side of the tape, I'm going into some recent deaths and leave the Iranian headlines for you to read in your daily newspapers. There's so much of it that I could just do hours and hours. But I think you get the gist of the conflicts and the various elements coming to a head. And I'll do more on it next week or 2 weeks from now, but I think I'll put it away and let you soak up some of the other material, because we can't get back to the Iranian question over and over again in the weeks to come. I don't think the team of David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski, and Jimmy Carter will be embarrassed or exposed or humiliated any further, and I wouldn't put it past them to go right into a confrontation if they had to save their reputation and their money. That's how little I think about these people. Mae Brussell, and it's tape number 418, side 2, December the 7th, 1979. There have been a lot of important deaths taking place, and I want to run them down with you for this side of the tape, and probably next week if I can put the Iranian matter aside. As I said before, we're going to begin 1980 in 3 more weeks, and 1970 saw some very important or interesting people pass away. Charles de Gaulle in 1970, J. Edgar Hoover in 72, Howard Hughes in 76, Hubert Humphrey, who worked along and was paid off by Howard Hughes, passed us as a liberal and worked with the fascist war machine, died in 78. Lyndon Johnson in 1973, Charles Lindbergh in 74, Pope Paul VI, Mr. Montini, the Secretary of the Vatican at one time in 1978, Martha Mitchell, 1976, Aristotle Onassis, 1975, and Nelson Rockefeller. Those were some pretty big movers that passed away in the 70s, very important people that affected our lives for the next 1,000 years to come. I really think they did. Hoover, Hughes, Johnson, Lindbergh, certainly, and Montini, the Pope Paul VI, Onassis, Rockefeller, and Martha Mitchell. These people did affect our lives. I made a hit list. Jimmy Carter's mother made a list, thought that Khomeini should be killed. I made a hit list for this year, maybe in the 1980s or quickly, in the order of appearances: Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, David Rockefeller, Paul Laxalt with Ronald Reagan, Martin Bormann, Mr. Mengele down in Paraguay, Mr. Somoza, Adolf Hitler, if he's still in Switzerland. A lot of you people don't believe that, but I've been told by different sources, and I don't have any reason to disbelieve it. We'll find out. Someday you'll find out. And there are a few other people I have on the hit list, but the world will be a better place when these movers that are holding on, the remnants of that other machine, are gone. So if you make your dartboards, you might pin their name up and do a little voodoo on them if you believe in that, and see if we can't clean the world out of these people that are just hell-bent on creating death and death machines all over the world. Jack Anderson wrote an article. This was November the 16th, but I haven't had a chance to share it with you on the tapes, titled "Nixon Helped Rich Nazis Stay in the United States, Another Black Chapter in Nixon's History but has been hidden." And he says that he's found this out in secret government files, but of course we know that he's talking about the Wanted Search for the Nazis, that book by Mr. Blumen that talks about the offices of Nixon being used for Nikolai Malaksa and the dummy front, the Western Tube Company. Nikolai Malaksa was the head of the Iron Guard in Romania, a Nazi with links to the Odessa and down to Argentina, where he connected with various people involved in the Kennedy assassination. It's interesting that for 3 months in a row, Jack Anderson has had articles, one on Operation Condor, the assassination team coming out of Chile, the Colonial Dignidad. The next month he did one on Project Paperclip and the importation of Nazis in this country, and then this last month he's done one on Nixon and Malaksa and the Iron Guard. It's interesting that he's spacing these out, and he should be encouraged, if you want to write and commend him for this and ask him for even more information. There's another article this last month of Rosalyn Carter. It was in the Washington Post, and I didn't see it in our local papers. This was just done by Maxine Cheshire, and it's a picture of Rosalyn with a person, and I did one tape on John Ellsworth, a man, an agent provocateur that was with Rosalyn Carter in the White House, who set up the Altamont scene where the Rolling Stones played, and a Mr. Meredith was killed on camera to break up the hippie rock scene out at Altamont, California. And this same provocateur was now in with a children's fund and working in the White House through Rosalyn Carter, associated with her. But this article says that on April the 11th, 1979, a picture was taken at the Capitol Hilton Hotel with a man named Jimmy Eppolito, the son of a powerful New York City narcotics and loan sharking figure, the son of James B. Eppolito. A White House photographer recorded the scene, promised an 8x10 glossy picture to Eppolito. The promise was never kept, though, because Eppolito and the father and son were gunned down in a mob killing in New York, October the 1st. It is widely believed that the federal law enforcement circles here and in New York felt that they might be alive today if Jimmy Eppolito hadn't been photographed in the White House with Rosalyn Carter. They became very visible when they were seen with Mrs. Carter. They were working on a project called Cities in the Schools, and Rosalyn Carter was with John Eppolito. The contact came through this Mr. Ellsworth, agent provocateur from Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and was set up by Maurice Weir, W-E-I-R. This man was part of a fraudulent children's appeal that worked with Mr. Ellsworth. One source close to the Eppolito homicide investigation said last week that Jimmy's desire to fraternize publicly with Mrs. Carter made his Underworld associates very nervous because there'd be too much heat on their gun running and drug trafficking. Eppolito brought his wife to the luncheon in Washington, D.C., and they were photographed, as I say, with the First Lady. And then shortly afterwards, Eppolito was gunned down with his father, and they were involved in a lot of criminal activities. The article says that Mr. Ellsworth's contacts in the Carter camp were with this Maurice Weir, who works in the White House running the Cities in Schools program in the District of Washington, D.C., and that this gang of Ellsworth and Eppolito and all were buddies. They were close, and they were in the White House and were photographed in there. But it's interesting that these were some of the top crime families in the United States of America photographed in the White House. The father and son were both gunned down, and I don't know if you saw the article. I only saw it in one place, so I'm passing it on with you. Mrs. Carter's been with some nice people, Jim Jones, Mr. Gracie in Chicago, with James Eppolito and that gang from organized crime. But the feeling was, as I say, that they had to be gunned down, the father and son, because it would cause too much attention. In fact, Eppolito, it goes on to say, was under investigation at the time that he was seen with Mrs. Carter for a bust that had to do with $50 million worth of hashish. And that's a pretty nice gang to be with, for the Carters to be with, a guy who's in a questionable transaction for $50 million worth of hashish. It goes on to say that the Secret Service doesn't check out people such as Eppolito unless the president and his wife ask them to, and Mrs. Carter just refused last week to have a routine social visit check, and that's how he happened to get through. Now, I don't believe that the White House doesn't check out every single person, but here is a woman with a man involved with gun running, narcotics, and questioned by the law enforcement, and then gunned down, and there really was a lot of blackout about this in the major news media. Phoenix, Arizona has a story that went over the wire services about Underworld ledger that lists 5 persons that were slain recently, 5 labor leaders and gambling interest personalities. They were involved with Richard Nixon and Jimmy Hoffa, and Nixon's name is on these books, claiming that he received $500,000 for pardoning Jimmy Hoffa, but that they were involved in 5 murders related to the Teamsters Union and Hoffa, and this tied in with Richard Nixon. The murders were Jimmy Hoffa, who died in 1975, who was last seen in Detroit in a parking lot. Al Bramlett, head of the Culinary Union in Las Vegas, his body was found in the desert. He was abducted from the Las Vegas airport. Tamara Rand, a San Diego businessman. G. William Cothard, former Nevada state legislature and ex-FBI agent. He had a dynamite blast in his car. And Edward Marty Bussiera, a gambling overseer at Caesar's Palace. Now, this article came out linking Richard Nixon in a ledger to these murders and this $500,000 payoff, and it is not investigated. Nixon goes on to New York and becomes quite prominent. When the Iranian crisis comes, he's on the air like a distinguished potentate, and no question about the ledgers or the scandal coming out in Phoenix, Arizona. But right after this came out, this was Friday, November the 18th, when those stories came out about the murders. Then a week later, November the 25th, that was November the 16th, the stories broke Friday, November the 16th, and by November 25th, that's just a week later, another witness to the Al Bramlett case was murdered. That was Tom Hanley. He was a Nevada union organizer, and he confessed to killing Al Bramlett. He was the man who allegedly confessed that he did the job with Al Bramlett, and he was in a jail in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he died just a week after this story broke, and he had testified as a government witness in a racketeering trial. Hanley was 63 years old and allegedly under guard at a hospital in Las Vegas, and they didn't believe that an autopsy would be made. They had no way of knowing how he died, and he supposedly died in the jail. But of course, it's Tom Hanley, who was hired to kill Al Bramlett, who would be the connecting link of Nixon and the payoffs. And so a week after this story broke, Al Bramlett was killed in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he died under guard in the hospital to, again, silence the connections to Richard Nixon and the payoffs and organized crime connections in Arizona and in Nevada. I did a lot of research on the Al Bramlett murder of the Culinary Workers Union in Vegas, because at that time the Howard Hughes empire owned these hotels in Las Vegas, and they gave some kind of an order suggesting killing the persons that were running these strikes. There were strikes for higher wages at the hotels in the Culinary Union, and there was a talk of murdering the labor organizer if he interfered and tried to raise their wages. And so the head of the Culinary Workers Union, Al Bramlett, was murdered. And I had studied that, and as I say, Tom Hanley was put in jail for it. But if he were to talk about who hired him, it would break this case wide open. So this was filed, the Bramlett story, under labor organizers and also under the Howard Hughes empire. And I think it's interesting that the name of Bramlett comes up now as why he was murdered or what gang murdered him. And as I say, a week later, the man who allegedly did it is bumped off when the story breaks open. There's another story out of West Berlin called Political Time Bomb of a Nazi Legacy. It says that 34 years after the demise of the Third Reich, the United States authorities have 40 tons of old Nazi documents and files that have the names and personal data of millions of Germans affiliated with the Hitler movement. This list is kept by the government, and it's been secret. It was kept in the SS bunkers in West Berlin in the American sector, and the Nazi Guard members have kept the names. There were 400,000 brown shirt stormtroopers, 230,000 SS elite guards, 60,000 SS officers. Well, about 26 men were hung at Nuremberg, and the rest are alive today unless they've died of old age. So stashed away, according to this article, in underground depository are the files and names of Nazi teachers, medical associations, and so forth. In 1967, there was an effort with West Germany to get the names, and they still have not given them to us. And according to this article, it's called a time bomb. Under lock and key in a U.S. installation are the names of these people, and this article says that the Nazi Reich conquerors would never want anyone to get their names on these files. They're useful to show who belongs to the Reich so that they can use them again or trust them. But if they came out, we would know who in the government today, running the various police departments and the various districts and councils, were part of either the stormtroopers, the SS elite guards, or the SS officers. The West German courts don't want to turn these over. They have the list of these people. There were 61,000 that were accused of serious Nazi war crimes, and at the time only 6,300 were convicted. 163 got life terms, no death penalty, and of course we know there's only supposed to be one person locked up at the time for these crimes. This material is a time bomb. It's referred to as a time bomb of the Nazi legacy, but they will not release it because this would be the backbone of World War III and the people that are in power today that they can trust. And the United States has been in collusion to protect this list of people and not let the names out to follow where they are today. I'm sure many of you read about the false alarm, the 6-minute alarm on the nuclear attack that went off. The computer didn't work. We had a false missile attack, and the airplanes went out from Kingsley Field in Oregon and from Sawyer Air Force Base in Missouri, and 6 from a Canadian Forces base in British Columbia. I have to laugh because many of you know that I really do want to leave the United States and move out of the country before too long, and I bought property over in British Columbia, and when they sent those planes out, they were approximately 6 miles away from where the property is that I bought. People say, where can you escape or where can you go to? But I guess the U.S. Forces alert system, I knew that there were these bases nearby, in the town nearby, but when the false alarm went off, the planes went right out. Either I'll be very protected in that little location, it'll be the first place to be bombed out. But I was surprised to see the city on the map when I read where the planes came from British Columbia. I've done many tapes on the Vatican money that's been missing, and Mr. Sindona, I haven't updated that recently now that he's appeared and the Pope's gone home. The trial for the bank in New York City for taking the money from there and manipulating their millions of dollars hasn't gone to trial yet. That also is very quiet. We could do a whole year of tapes on quiet matters that never get a follow-up. But there was only one paper in the United States that I have clippings from that linked the missing Vatican money to Mr. Sindona and organized crime. As I say, we have articles, and I've done tapes on Sindona and the links to organized crime, and there's been current articles that the Vatican is missing money, and I've made those connections of Sindona and the Vatican to organized crime. But the Houston Post, of all papers, has an article, Vatican reportedly lost millions on Sindona's dealings, and they were making connections between the misuse of $45 million of the Franklin National Bank and their missing money. And while we know the Pope had a meeting of his various cardinals after he came home from the United States and talked about the Vatican losing $20 million a year, it was the Houston Post that really ran a story. I was very surprised on the links of the missing money to specifically Mr. Sindona's dealings. And of course those do tie in to the Gambino family and organized crime. But it's funny that you wouldn't expect that in the Houston Post. I've learned from a long time of experience that you take a cross-section of newspapers from around the country, and where you least expect it, you sometimes get a glimmer of truth that the other papers are leaving out. This one came from Houston. We haven't heard a word of Sindona since he appeared, and since 3 of the major witnesses were killed in Italy, and since the Pope had his meeting. I wonder what's going on there, and if this case will ever really go to trial, or if it's going to go to the dead bone pile of affairs that just fade away and better left alone and not brought up again. I did get in a letter, and I might mention it, there was a suggestion, a criticism that I go into certain questions such as Rockefeller's death last January and then ignore the cause or the effect of it, and in quotes, you walk right away, right off, and leave it, or just forget it. Many of these events become non-events. They're not followed up. The Jonestown affair we went into at length, and then it was dropped, and there's no criminal investigations. There's nothing into exposing who formed Jonestown, who bought the property, where the missing hitmen are. There's never been any more on Mr. Eshikoff, the doctor that ordered the cremation of Rockefeller, or David Listick, or Porchetta Pierce, or the people involved with the Rockefeller death. The missing John Paisley of the CIA, National Security Agency. His wife couldn't get insurance for him because they said they still believe he's alive. The discrepancies there at his death and the cremation again without her seeing the body. The Sindona affair, the missing Vatican money. We could go through crises, just the crisis that happened last year, the unsolved murders, the passing the buck. These are unfinished. I don't forget them, and I'm not walking away, but they just go into the file of non-events as if they didn't happen, and somebody just hopes that nobody will remember them. I don't know if I'm allowed to use obscenity when these tapes are played on the air. The newspaper is certainly printing a lot of obscenities, and, for example, in San Francisco, Joe Freitas is running this week for district attorney again in a runoff, and he was close to Tim Stone and Jim Jones and the whole Jonestown affair and didn't investigate it, covered it up, and he had a meeting with some people. He's campaigning in San Francisco. I can't believe that Freitas can face the public after what happened with Dan White and George Moscone and Harvey Milk's murders, the way White was prosecuted, or the DA's office is run, and covering up the voting scandal. Jim Jones links to DA Freitas in that office. But Fred was running for the DA this week, and yesterday had a press conference, and somebody asked him, well, what were your links? How did you cover up Jonestown? And he got simply furious. This is in the San Francisco Chronicle, and he just said, fuck you. And this is the district attorney of San Francisco, who never has been asked that question publicly. And then, this is again from the Chronicle, he called the reporter an asshole, said, you asshole, and huffed and puffed and went away. Now, that is the answer that the district attorney in San Francisco gave. I hope the radio programs forgive me, or they can bleep it out. But I read it in the newspaper, so it's a direct quotation from the San Francisco Chronicle. That is the response that the district attorney in San Francisco gave to a question when he's running for office about Jonestown. He's just so blatant that they don't give a damn. I mean, this is the kind of vulgarity to a very serious matter when 923 people were killed. And that's the way he responded to a question when he's running for office at the city, and that's the only answer he gave, and that's how he feels about it. And what are all those deaths? What are the assassination teams that are on the loose? That's all he would say about the matter, and that's how he feels. And if the public accepts that, that's what they're going to get, are butchers who just use profanities when they're asked hard questions. I've been getting letters from various listeners of the tapes asking me what I think about these oil spills and these explosions and spilling of chemicals and various fires and leaks going in plants and accidents, plane crashes and bus crashes and so forth. And I'm getting letters, are there too many of these? What do you think is happening? And that's why it's so important that I began to read the book Sabotage that I referred to earlier, the one by Albert Kahn and Michael Sayers. And that was written in 1942, and it tells about the purposeful intention of the Germans to destroy the United States from the inside up till the war and up through the war years, and I'm sure they continued afterwards. And it tells about burning bridges, blowing up tanks, setting fires, assassination teams, chemical spills. And I actually believe that a lot of this is happening. And along those lines, there was an article just last week in the newspaper, a question and answer, asking if Babcock and Wilcox, the company that built 3 Mile Island, is it true that the people who own that were sent to jail because of negligence? And the answer was no one was sent to jail because of the accident at 3 Mile Island. Babcock and Wilcox, manufacturer of nuclear plants, was bought for $748 million last year by J. Ray McDermott and Company, builders of offshore drilling platforms. Several months ago, 4 McDermott executives were fined $282,000 and given suspended sentences of 1 to 3 years for price fixing. The 4 were Charles Graves, Robert Ritchie, H.W. Bailey, and H. Roger Reeves, none of whom have gone to jail. The McDermott Company, however, has been fined $1 million for making illegal political contributions and for racketeering. Now, I'm wondering if I have wondered about the nuclear plant being sabotaged and, again, destroying our confidence in our own energy. I know we don't have a place to take the waste, but France and England and various countries are building nuclear plants. And I'm wondering if our places are sabotaged along with other leaks, because this costs millions and millions and millions of dollars and slows down our energy or our ability to defend ourselves. Remember how the Germans had synthetic fuel? They had rubber for tires. They had an economy that sustained itself even if there was a blockade, but we are totally dependent, and if our oil is cut off and our energy is cut off, and I know that so much of the racketeering and organized crime works with the saboteurs, and so this article says that these people worked with and made contributions, political contributions, and so forth, and worked with racketeering people, so that Babcock and Wilcox Manufacturers was sold to J. Ray McDermott and Company, and these 4 people who bought it are at the least not very kosher, but goodness knows what is going on with so many plants leaking, and there is a possibility that that could have been sabotaged and mishandled to create one of 1,000 crises which we're going through right now. I do want to, in the next few weeks, just do a rundown on some of the medical spills, the accidents, the leaks, and what's taking place all across the country. Is just shocking when you add it up. The 4th and last Montoya brother died this last week, and I didn't see his name once on any national television. I was watching the Iranian crisis across the board, If you saw it, let me know. It was a UPI story. Albuquerque, New Mexico State Senator Theodore Montoya. He was one of 4 politically powerful brothers. This reminds me of John Kennedy and his older brother, and then Robert, and now Ted running. There were 4 brothers that were all state senators, and one of them, Joseph Montoya, was on the Senate Watergate Committee, and there was a suggestion at some time of possible links of organized crime, and I don't know whether the Montoyas were linked to the Phoenix, Arizona operation, and that's why this man just died this week. He's 44 years old. They said he had had one other heart condition before, but I think of William Harvey and Sheffield Edwards and these other important people dying at the time of the Senator Church Committee. He was chairman of the State Judiciary Committee in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In their Senate, there were brothers Tom Montoya, Joe, Al, and Ted. This one, 44 years old, he went to Oregon, came back to Albuquerque. Instead of going where his wife and family were, he stayed in an apartment that night, didn't show up the next morning, and he was found dead. 4 people, 4 Democrats, 4 powerful persons in New Mexico and in Washington, D.C., all 4 brothers died within 6 years, and as I say, there really was a news blackout on the Montoya family. There was an interesting comment about the airplane over Antarctica that crashed this last week. 257 people were killed, and the newspaper said that they were looking for a voice recorder of the jet line that crashed, that they had 30 minutes of conversation that they found of the crew that they should be able to put together from this recorder. But the articles in the newspapers that I take said, in quotes, the black box that they're looking contained records of the flight data that has not yet been found. No bodies have been recovered yet, as the searchers are concentrating on locating the black box. They think that only 50 to 70 of the bodies may be recovered because of a polar blizzard after the crash, but they don't want the bodies until they locate the black box. That certainly sounds a little mysterious or strange, why it was important to get the box before you look for the persons on the plane. There are a lot of crazy things in the news that remind you of the insane times in which we live. One is an article out of New York. It's called The Defense Lawyer Who Won 299 Murder Cases. He's Sir Lionel Luckhoo of Guyana. He won acquittal for one client who killed his second wife with poisoned milk, even though the first wife died under the same circumstances. And then it says Lionel managed to clear every murder defendant he ever represented, and he made the Book of Records, the Guinness Book of Records, for the most successful criminal lawyer in the world. He had a perfect record of getting everybody off that he represented. This Sir Lionel Luckhoo of Guyana was knighted by Queen Elizabeth in 1965. He works in Georgetown, Guyana. And then it goes on to say he was Reverend Jim Jones' personal attorney and legal counsel to the People's Temple for 18 months prior to the Jonestown massacre. He represented Jim Jones in fighting the custody case of the Stones. They wanted their little boy, the 6-year-old boy that stayed down in the massacre and allegedly died. The Stones haven't said much about him, and I'm not sure that they think he's dead or escaped with the boat people that did get away. There hasn't been much said about that little boy, and no proof that he died there. But it's interesting that a man that was knighted by Queen Elizabeth should also represent Jim Jones in keeping various American citizens away from getting their family in Jonestown. I think this is important because Jonestown was leased by people who had been to London. Tim Stone and Terry Buford had money over there for Jones in London, and the Blakeys. There were people that helped set up Jonestown that were directly involved in London. So here is a man familiar or recognized by the Queen and the royal family who is protecting that investment in Jonestown that was obviously set up by the British as well as American intelligence together. I have about 40 more important deaths that I wanted to talk with you or share with you. So we'll continue with those next week. Take care. I hope we're not in war during the next week, and keep well. It's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and we'll share the bad news again next Friday, okay?